We're pleased to be joined by Beckerman, reporter and author of the book How to Be a Dissident, which I am really excited to discuss a bit of today. But first, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, the pleasure's all ours, definitely. So let's just start with maybe the obvious first question, just what is a dissident? Like, what does it mean to be a
Yeah.
dissident? How much of it is about opposing power policy versus building alternatives to it and that kind of thing?
Good question. And because people do have a kind of a basic assumption of what a dissident is, and it's a little bit different than what I think of as a dissident.
Mhm.
I think for most people, the notion of a dissident is somebody who is challenging power in some kind of dramatic way. Maybe they're even at a barricades, you know. And I think of those people mostly as revolutionaries. Like if you have some kind of ideology that you want to take over or some power that you're looking to replace, in my mind, you're more of a revolutionary. A dissident is a sort of is a different creature. And so I go back to the word dissident actually is from Latin. It means from dissidere, which means to sit apart, right? And a dissident is somebody who experiences something in their reality that violates their sense of sort of moral rightness, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that could be, your neighbor is mistreated. Somehow, you're not allowed to speak your mind or read what you want to read or wear your hair the way you want to wear your hair. Um, and it undermines like your basic sense of what and this is going to sound like a vague phrase, but what a normal life should consist of. And that person reacts. They say no. They resist. They refuse to have that aspect of themselves curtailed. Now, most of us don't do this. Most of us are not dissidents. Most of us go along. We conform because actually that's very much a natural part of being a human being. Like we're deeply hardwired to conform. Like our species has survived because we've sort of managed to get along within tribes and not constantly create anarchy, right? So the dissident is a unique individual who is willing to sit apart, to say no.
And how important do you think that is to politics, especially to have people who, when they see something that they feel is awry, that are willing to voice that or willing to try to make something happen versus a lot of people would, maybe go on like party lines or even if you could not just politics, but like cultural people will just be like, it's just, how society is, we'll let it
Right.
happen. So how important is it for dissidents in a society and a culture and politics, that kind of thing?
I think it's really important. I mean, I often think about, I did this sort of thought experiment when I was writing this book, because I look a lot at history, at the dissidents throughout history have sort of slightly shifted society in important ways, even if they didn't know in their lifetime if they were going to achieve the thing that they wanted to do. And then I've sort of done this thought experiment, like what is history without dissidents? And it's either like, you know, a long story of like subordination
Mhm.
or stasis of things not changing. So you sort of need this like squeaky wheel, like you need this person who, and then, ultimately, hopefully it's not just one person, but people who find each other who feel this same way to start to question a status quo that feels unjust or is not serving the interests of, the large number of people.
And in the book that you wrote, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was 10 sort of I guess characteristics or so that you speak to of how to be a dissident. What are the one, and you can go through as many as you feel
Yeah.
necessary. What are sort of these effective strategies, traits that make you an effective dissident?
Right. Well, I'll do like two of the early ones because and I think they're unusual enough that they might be interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and one of them is to be pessimistic. And this might seem sort of counterintuitive, right? Like we think like, oh, an activist needs to be like optimistic, and but I sort of came to the conclusion that pessimism might be an actually more useful attitude to have. And for this reason, well, first of all, let me say that people sometimes confuse pessimism with fatalism. So
Mhm.
fatalism is the notion that like everything is always going to get worse, right? Just inevitably always going to get worse. Um, that's fatalism. Pessimism is that it's probably going to get worse, but not necessarily, right?
Mhm.
Um, and if you think about that, like the opposite of it, optimism, that the world is probably going to get better, that can also lead to a lot of passivity, right? It can lead to a lot of sitting around going like, well, if some scientist is probably going to eventually figure out how to solve climate change, or if like the better forces in our country are going to help stop authoritarianism, like I don't really need to do anything, right? But if you have the opposite attitude, which is um, things will probably get worse, right? So that opens up, in my mind, a space of action because you're like, I need to do something right now because they're going to get worse. And I've came to see that like the activists, especially when I was looking at like climate activists, for example, it's like in some ways, if you accept that, okay, the Earth is going to warm by a degree and a half or 2 degrees, and things are going to get worse, or they're probably going to get worse. Like, I need to do something right now, even if it means mitigating the worst of the effects, mitigating some of the cruel impact that it will have. So that's pessimism. Another one I really like early on in the book is be funny, because we sort of underestimate the power of humor to you know take off the clothes of the king, like, and portray him naked, and suddenly we're able to take him down because he's human, right? So humor has this wonderful capacity to just like irreverently question, puncture the things in our world, in our reality that feel inevitable, right? That feel like they could never change, that they're just taken for granted. Um, and because of that, like it can actually like really be a strong sort of force to wield.
Yeah, definitely on the second one, I think that that's kind of Trump's whole political shtick is he's the funny, entertaining guy, so he doesn't need to be,
Right.
experienced or intelligent or anything like that. I'm curious then when it comes to, I guess, building a movement or like coalition building or even just, the dissident trying to get people on their side or make the change that they want to see. How much should they care about the optics against the things that they're going to do? Like I think the climate movement is a good one where groups will go and I can't remember the group, but they like spray paint it one of those monuments, or they'll do this really like these disruptive things. But then you get a lot of pushback. You get bad media. Is that something that dissidents should calculate into what they're going to do, or should it just be, hey, like this is an urgent issue, we need to bring attention to it,
Right.
however
Right.
possible?
I mean, I think there has to be like a combination of tactics, right? So, I would never say that something that actually draws attention and sort of makes people suddenly aware of an issue or illustrates the injustice, right? I mean, if you look at the history of activism, there's been these incredible moments where people have brought down upon themselves the violence of the state, for example, in order to prove a point. I mean, the civil rights movement did this all the time, and it brought the reality and of the injustice home to people in a way that it might not have. So that's a kind of extreme example. But so on the one hand, I think that it's a great thing to sort of do things that draw immediate attention. But often I think what has not worked well for activism and for social movements in the last, let's say 15, 20 years is too much focus on the thing that is going to sort of get the immediate gratification. Like, let's get as many people out to the square, as quickly as possible, which we're now able to do, with our phones and such. But like that is not actually how you build to change. Like you need to have these features that allow for people to slowly change minds, slowly get onto the same page amongst themselves, which is a function, we don't often think about, which means sometimes being in smaller, slower spaces where they can actually communicate with one another, when there can be a sort of deliberation and egging one another on, and you can be vulnerable. I mean, you can sort of suggest ideas, without worrying that it's going to sort of be telegraphed to, millions of people. Like all of that is really, really important. And I fear sometimes that we've sort of forgotten that that is a really significant function towards actually slowly building to change.